So my journey begins in 2011 in an MSW class, where I was given a vignette of a black family who had been had their child removed from their care, and we were talking about all of the obstacles and barriers that this family was facing, and that's the first time that I learned about the concept of meeting your client where you're at. I was in class, I raised my hand and I said, how can we meet the client where they're at if we don't know where they've been? The professor was a little bit confused by that comment and wanted to know just kind of what my thoughts were more on it. And so I shared with them that in African traditions, we have this idea of Sankofa. It's looking back to move forward. And ultimately what that means is that we leverage our history to make efforts moving forward. And so we began to talk a little bit more about it, and my professor slowly kind of brought us back to just focusing on the client and on the individual needs. And so, but for me, that was kind of a watershed moment. It was the first time that I really understood that, you know what, in order to understand clients and for me to do my work, I had to understand the historical context in which the family was dealing with. In the Black community, that's things like colonialism and racism. And that, for me, that at least that was central in my work. And so from that point on, I always kind of had an eye towards history. And so, there you go. That's Sankofa. And so Sankofa has been really central in my research, in my practice, and it's also been a way in which I've kind of made sense on world events. And so I want to fast forward to 2020 and the shootings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, where social work had a reckoning, right? We had a whole bunch of symposium. The world was really kind of grappling with how are we going to address racism and social justice. And so for me, I didn't think we should start just there. I thought we should start by instead looking at previous efforts that we've made in this same thing. And so for me, I really kind of leveraged Sankofa to understand what our profession had done in the past, what worked and what didn't work. And so I went back in time and I looked at what social work looked like in different eras. And so I want to share two of those eras with you and how I leveraged them to kind of make have a better understanding of our profession's efforts. And so the two of them are the civil rights movement and then the era of Black scares. So starting with the civil rights movement, in the 1970s, on the heel of the civil rights movement, the U.S. was really grappling with how do we address racism, and then social work in kinds formed these 5 multicultural task forces whose job it was to provide insight into what social work could do to better address racism and inequality within the profession. And so these 5 multicultural task forces came up with, ultimately, when I did the research, 4 recommendations that I think are important to acknowledge. First, colonialism and racism are deeply embedded. You cannot address racism without addressing colonialism. You have to address them both. 2, that there's a lack of cultural content within social work education, and that lack of cultural content meant that they're largely unable to meet the racial and ethnic diversity needs of the populations that we serve. 2, that we really had to focus on affirmative action within the profession. And 4, that, again, 50 years ago, that social work regulation would lead to racial bias if it continued on a path that it was. And so I think we have to sit with this uncomfortable truth that much of what these task forces recommended 50 years ago still remain problems to today. And so, if we want the next 50 years of social work to look different than the last, we have to sit and think, what can we do? When future social workers look back on the profession, are they going to see another 50 years of inaction? or are they going to see another 50 years of us making changes, delivering on the promises that we make and the social work apologies that we make, and if we actually live up to the grand challenges? I want to go back to yet another era, the era of the Red Scares. During the Red Scares, I think that it parallels some of the challenges that we're facing today. Any efforts that were being made towards social justice were deemed as communist activities. Social workers face backlash, communities face backlash, and we often talk about the Red Scares, but there's also another phenomenon, era around the Black Red Scares. And so Black social workers, Black communities that were trying to do things like working towards Black liberation, also have faced more intense backlash that was deeply connected to racism. And so I think it's important to understand that during those eras, the tactics included things like repression, silencing, constant threats of losing your job and your position. And really, I think it's no surprise that right now we kind of face those same dilemmas, and that 50 years of inaction by the social work profession has led us to a place where we're unable to meet the challenges put in front of us and creating ones for future generations. And so for me, the role of history is really kind of understanding how we can bridge our knowledge of different historical eras to move the profession forward in a way that we're able to make kind of more meaningful contributions towards anti-racism and anti-colonialism. And so I think the eras like the Civil Rights Movement and the Red Scare, if we leverage them to push our profession forward, we could actually learn a lot from. And so, I want to, I think right now we're at a critical crossroads where we have the wisdom of the past, some pretty challenging barriers in front of us, but I think we can leverage that history to guide our profession forward. And so I want to end by connecting my journey. And so I think back to that class that I was in and how my professor kind of pushed aside what the role of history is. But now I'm a professor, and I get to teach my students how they can use social work history as a beacon to push our profession forward. And I think that we can use history as a guiding light to not only meet the client where they're at, but to better understand where they've come from and help guide them into a future that they want to be. Thank you.